The airport was alive with movement. People hurried past, dragging suitcases behind them. Some laughed, others talked on their phones, and the overhead speakers called out flight numbers in a steady rhythm. The check-in counters were busy, with passengers lining up, handing over their tickets, and making small talk with the staff. Among them stood Mia, a young black girl, waiting patiently in line, gripping her boarding pass at the front. A flight attendant named Sarah moved between counters, greeting travelers with a warm, practiced smile. Her uniform was crisp, her posture straight, and her voice cheerful as she assisted each person. But then, her eyes landed on Maya. For a brief second, something changed. Her smile wavered, just slightly, but enough to be noticed. It was quick, barely there, but unmistakable. Sarah took a small breath, straightened her shoulders, and forced the smile back onto her face. She approached Mia with the same cheerful energy she had given the other passengers, but there was something different this time. The air around them felt heavier, like an unseen tension had settled in. The noise of the airport continued, the rolling of luggage, the beeping scanners, the voices, but between Mia and Sarah, an invisible wall seemed to rise. Mia held out her ticket. Sarah took it, but instead of the usual quick glance, her eyes lingered on the paper. She scanned it slowly, as if looking for anything that might give her a reason to hesitate. Her fingers pressed against the paper a little too long, her expression unreadable. Mia felt a strange unease creeping in. Something wasn't right. Then, without warning, Sarah ripped the ticket in half. For a moment, Mia just stood there, frozen. Her mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Did that really just happen? The paper, her access to the flight, her way forward, was now in two useless pieces. Sarah still wore a polite smile, but it was different now, forced, hollow. She held Mia's gaze for only a second before looking away. "There's a problem with your ticket," she said, her tone light, dismissive, almost as if this were a minor inconvenience. Maya felt her heart pound. Why her? No one else in line had been treated like this. No other ticket had been torn. She wasn't causing trouble, wasn't being loud, wasn't doing anything wrong. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to demand an answer, to push back, but she didn't. Not yet. She had dealt with moments like this before, small things, subtle things. A look, a hesitation, a feeling that she didn't quite belong. But this was different. This wasn't quiet or hidden. It was right in the open, clear for everyone to see. And yet, no one spoke up. People in line shuffled forward, pretending not to notice. Sarah handed the torn ticket back, her fingers brushing against Mia's for just a second. "You'll need to check with the supervisor," she said, her voice smooth, as if she had just given simple directions. Mia stared at her, but Sarah didn't look back. The conversation was already over in her mind. She had already moved on. Mia took a slow breath. What was happening? Was this just a misunderstanding, or was it something more? She glanced around. No one stepped forward to say anything. The world kept moving, but for Mia, everything had shifted. What was she supposed to do now? She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this flight was about to change everything. Mia's fingers tightened around the torn ticket. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. The world around her kept moving, passengers chatting, luggage wheels rolling, announcements echoing, but inside, everything felt still. Her heartbeat drummed in her ears. The flight attendant, Lisa, stood in front of her, posture stiff, eyes avoiding Mia's. "You need to check with the supervisor," she repeated, her voice flat, almost bored, like this was just another routine issue. Mia didn't move. She didn't argue. She just stared. There was something in Lisa's expression that Mia recognized. That forced politeness, that empty smile, it wasn't new to her. She had seen it before. She had felt it before. But this time, it was different. Lisa wasn't just being dismissive. She wasn't just acting uninterested. She was making a decision. A decision about Maya. Mia swallowed hard. Her first instinct was to stay quiet, to not make a scene, but her gut told her something was wrong. She could feel the weight of Lisa's judgment pressing down on her, even though no words were spoken. Why did this feel so personal? The seconds stretched. The silence between them grew heavier. Then a voice broke through. A strong, steady voice. "What's going on here?" Mia turned, her breath catching for just a second. Her father was walking toward her. Tall, confident, dressed in a sharp, well-tailored suit, he moved with the kind of presence that turned heads. His expression was calm, unreadable, but his eyes locked onto Lisa with quiet intensity. Lisa's reaction was immediate. Her shoulders stiffened. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she had just realized she made a mistake. A big mistake. Passengers around them started to notice. Whispers spread through the crowd. People turned their heads, sensing that something was unfolding. Lisa's polite mask slipped just for a second. She looked nervous now. There's just a mix-up with the system," she stammered, suddenly trying to explain. "I didn't mean Mia's father didn't let her finish." He stepped closer, his voice controlled but firm. "Let me make something very clear," he said, his tone even but filled with power. "Mia is my daughter." Then he delivered the words that made Lisa's face go pale. "And this is my airport." The weight of his words hit like a thunderclap. For a moment, the entire terminal seemed to freeze. Lisa's lips parted, her breath unsteady. She blinked, looking at Mia, then at her father. Passengers whispered louder now. Some gasped. Others exchanged stunned glances. Lisa had just humiliated the wrong person. Mia remained quiet, watching Lisa's reaction. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was already sinking in. Lisa fumbled for words. I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know who she was." Mia's expression didn't change. Her voice was calm, steady. "It doesn't matter who I am," she said. "What matters is how you treated me." Lisa's face crumbled. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Mia's father stood beside her, arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. The silence was heavier than before. Lisa had nothing left to say. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. Lisa's hands trembled as she tried to explain, but the damage was already done. The entire check-in area had gone quiet. The murmurs from the crowd had shifted, no longer just whispers, but gasps of realization. She had made a huge mistake. Mia stood firm, her father beside her. His presence alone had shifted the power in the situation. His words still lingered in the air. "This is my airport." Lisa swallowed hard, her face drained of color. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who she was." Mia didn't blink. Her expression stayed calm, her voice even. "It doesn't matter who I am," she said. "What matters is how you treated me." Lisa's breath hitched. She looked around as if searching for an escape. The passengers watching, the employees nearby, everyone had seen what had happened. There was no way out of this. I'm so sorry," Lisa finally blurted out. "I didn't mean to." Mia held up a hand, stopping her. She didn't need Lisa's excuses. She didn't need to hear how Lisa was just following some unspoken rule in her head. This was bigger than just an apology. Mia's father turned toward her. His face was unreadable, but his voice was calm. "Mia, it's up to you now." Lisa's eyes widened. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." Mia's gaze didn't waver. She had spent her whole life dealing with moments like this, subtle, quiet moments where people made her feel like she didn't belong. This time, she had the power. She exhaled slowly, then met Lisa's desperate stare. "You can't take back what you did," Mia said, her tone steady. "But I don't need to ruin your life over this." She stepped back. "I'm done." Lisa sagged as if the weight of the moment had finally crushed her. The crowd around them began to disperse, but the lesson lingered. Mia turned toward her father, and together they walked away, heads high, shoulders back. Lisa remained frozen, standing alone at the counter. Her heart pounded as she watched them disappear into the terminal. She had been taught a lesson she would never forget. As Mia and her father walked away from the check-in counter, the tension still hung in the air. People were still whispering, some shaking their heads, others staring at Lisa, the flight attendant, who stood frozen in place. She had humiliated the wrong person. Lisa's hands were clammy. Her mind raced, but no excuse could undo what she had just done. She had let her bias take control, and now she had to face the consequences. Mia didn't need to gloat. She didn't even look back. But the silence she left behind said everything. Her father's voice was low, meant just for her ears. "You handled that well," he said. Mia glanced up at him. "I just told the truth," she replied. Her father nodded. And that's exactly why it mattered. Lisa stood there, watching them disappear into the terminal. Her heartbeat was erratic, her face hot with shame. She had thought she had control in that moment. She had thought no one would question her decision. But now she'd been exposed. She felt the stares of passengers still in line, their gazes heavy with judgment. Someone shook their head. Another person whispered, "Unbelievable." Lisa wanted to shrink away, to disappear behind the counter. A coworker leaned in. "You really messed up," they muttered. Lisa swallowed hard. She knew. She had let her assumptions define how she treated someone. And she had picked the wrong person to underestimate. Mia hadn't just stood up for herself, she had set a new standard. The lesson was clear. Respect isn't something you give only when it's convenient. It's something everyone deserves, no matter who they are. And Lisa? She would never make the same mistake again. As Mia and her father walked away from the check-in counter, the energy in the airport shifted. Conversations started up again, people returned to their routines, but the lesson in the air remained. Lisa, the flight attendant, still stood frozen, her breath shallow. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the spot where Mia had stood just moments ago. She had made a terrible mistake, and she knew it. She thought she had power over the situation, but she had underestimated the truth. She had judged someone based on nothing but assumptions, and it had just backfired in the worst way. Passengers were still watching. Some shook their heads. Others whispered among themselves. Lisa could feel every set of eyes on her, burning with silent judgment. A coworker nudged her. "What were you thinking?" Their voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of the words hit Lisa like a brick. She wasn't thinking that was the problem. He had let her own bias cloud her judgment. And now, she had been exposed for it. Mia hadn't needed to raise her voice. She didn't have to cause a scene. She'd handled the situation with grace and strength. And that alone had been enough to make Lisa realize just how wrong she had been. Lisa swallowed, forcing herself to breathe, but nothing could take away the weight of what had just happened. Mia's father's words rang in her ears. "Mia is my daughter. And this is my airport." She had just humiliated the last person she should have. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she turned to her coworker, hoping for some kind of reassurance. But all they did was shake their head. "You need to be better than this," they muttered before walking away. Lisa was left standing there, feeling the full weight of her actions. Meanwhile, Mia and her father continued walking, their footsteps steady, their heads held high. They didn't need to look back. The message had already been sent. Mia knew she had done the right thing. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly. She had stood up when it mattered. And Lisa? She would never forget this moment. Because today, she had learned that prejudice always has consequences. As Mia and her father moved toward their gate, the energy between them remained calm but firm. Her father walked with confidence, his presence demanding attention without a single word. Mia, by his side, felt something shift within her, something strong, something unshakable. She had been tested today. But she hadn't crumbled. Lisa, the flight attendant, still stood behind the counter, her hands clenched at her sides. Her stomach twisted as she replayed the moment over and over in her head. She thought about the look in Maya's eyes, not anger, not even shock, but something much deeper. Disappointment. People who yelled, demanded things, or caused a scene. But Mia? She had done none of that. She had let the truth speak for itself. And that's what stung the most. Lisa had been wrong. She had seen Mia, judged her in an instant, and acted in a way she could never take back. And now? She had been exposed for it, not just to Maya, not just to her father, but to everyone. The murmurs around the check-in area hadn't faded completely. Some people still whispered, throwing quick glances her way. A few employees looked at her with disappointment, while others avoided her gaze entirely. It was suffocating. Lisa turned to her coworker, hoping for reassurance. Instead, they shook their head. "What were you thinking?" The words stung. Because deep down, she knew she hadn't been thinking. Mia hadn't needed to punish her. The damage was already done. The weight of the moment pressed down on Lisa's shoulders. Her actions had real consequences, and she would carry them long after Maya had boarded that plane. As Mia and her father walked toward their gate, she felt something settle inside her. She had stood her ground. She hadn't let this moment define her in a negative way. And most importantly, she had shown the world that dignity and respect matter. Lisa knew she would never forget this day, and neither would anyone else who had watched it unfold. As Mia and her father walked away from the counter, the weight of the moment still hung in the air. The check-in area had returned to its usual rhythm, passengers chatting, announcements echoing, but something had changed. Lisa, the flight attendant, still stood frozen behind the counter, her mind racing. The moment replayed in her head like a broken record. She had judged Mia without thinking, acted on an assumption that she couldn't take back. And now, she had been exposed. Not just to Mia, not just to her father, but to everyone who had witnessed it. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Around her, other employees avoided her gaze. A few threw her disapproving looks. Even passengers in line whispered about what had just happened. Lisa had handled difficult situations before, but this wasn't just a mistake. This was a lesson, one she had taught herself in the worst way possible. Mia hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't demanded anything. She had simply let the truth come to light. And that's why it stung so much. Lisa looked down at her hands. They were shaking. The realization was hitting her hard. She had assumed something about Mia without knowing her at all. She had let her own bias guide her actions. And now, everyone knew it. She turned to one of her coworkers for reassurance. But instead of comfort, they shook their head and muttered. The words hit harder than she expected. Lisa had always thought of herself as a professional, someone who knew how to handle any situation. But today, she had been the one in the wrong, and there was no way to undo it. Meanwhile, Mia walked beside her father, her head held high. She could feel the eyes on her, the silent weight of what had just happened. But she wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't even angry anymore. She was stronger because of it. She had faced prejudice and walked away with her dignity intact. And that was more powerful than any revenge. Lisa knew she would never forget this moment. And neither would anyone else who had seen it. As Mia and her father stepped away from the counter, the tension in the air lingered like a shadow. The check-in area had gone back to its usual pace, passengers talking, rolling their suitcases, checking their phones, but some of them still glanced over, their expressions unreadable. Back at the counter, Emily, the flight attendant, stood stiffly, her hands gripping the desk. Her heart was pounding, but not from anger, from realization. She had made a terrible mistake. She had assumed. She had judged Mia unfairly. And now, the truth had hit her like a cold wave. The other employees nearby kept their distance. A few stole quick looks at her, their faces unreadable. A manager passing by slowed down, eyes narrowing as if sensing something had just happened. Emily felt her face burn. She had always been careful with her words, always professional. But today, she had let her own prejudice dictate her actions. And everyone had seen it. She had torn up Mia's ticket. She had dismissed her without thinking. And worst of all, she had only backtracked when she realized who Mia's father was. The weight of that truth made her stomach twist. Her breath hitched as she finally dared to glance toward Mia. The young woman was walking beside her father, her posture strong, confident, unshaken. She wasn't looking back. She didn't need to, because she had already won. Emily felt the heavy stares from the people around her. Whispers floated through the air. She wanted to say something, to explain, to fix it, but there was nothing she could do. She had already shown the world who she was. Mia didn't need revenge. She didn't need to yell or cause a scene. She'd made her point just by standing tall. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. She had learned a lesson today, a painful, humiliating one. And she knew she would never forget it.